Hey everyone, Anna from girlsonkey.com. Welcome to the Monday Book Club. Today's interview was an interview I did with Siobhan Harvey about her book Cloudboy. Siobhan Harvey is the winner of the Kathleen Grattan Prize in New Zealand, and we interview her about her book, and I'm also going to read from an article that we did about Siobhan. When poet Siobhan Harvey's differently abled son Cameron was 5, he asked her to join him atop the jungle gym at the playground to watch the clouds with him. Ignoring the other children fighting over the seesaw and swings, Cameron was content to look up at the sky and read the ciphers and pictures in the clouds. It was then that Siobhan had a revelation about her child, who she nicknamed Cloudboy. This became the title of her poetry collection. I suddenly realised that all of his obsessions were connected, says Siobhan. His obsession with Doctor Who meant he knew all the 12 doctors and could cite any episode. That was about wormholes and journeying into the mind and other dimensions. It was giving him validation that his constant journeying into a subject, into his own mind, that it was okay, she says, of her son's unconventional love of deciphering the heavens. So award-winning poet Siobhan had dedicated her latest poetry collection to Cameron. It's Siobhan's hope that when her son is an adult, he'll look back at this book and see her attempt to assist him through a difficult childhood. I don't know what the future is going to hold, but this is a gift for his future, she says. What I would aspire to is that this book be part of a bigger shift in the thinking on the issues around how we treat children like this, says Siobhan. The collection called Cloudboy was released through Otago Press. Here is an excerpt from the interview with Siobhan.
We as a culture are deeply connected to, at most levels of artistic, in the artistic arena, are driven towards, are reassured by, are connected back to, and readily want to access narrative. Yes. That's what drives us. So it doesn't matter if it's poetry, and it doesn't matter if it's film. The connection is narrative. So I'm drawn by that idea of a theme, which will offer a strong showcase of a story, yes, and by a narrative that I can develop out of that theme.
Yes, because it's very cohesive, and both of your collections have been like that.
I think that's part of also the terrain or the consequence of writing out of a subject and a theme and a narrative, is that you do, what comes as part of that is a cohesion of the idea, yes, into translation of the actual concept, the resulting work.
Yes, and so from Lost Relatives through to Cloudboy, tell me a bit about the progression, in terms of your own work from that collection to this one.
Previous collection, it took literally 10 years of writing, and it was writing as part of a day-to-day lived experience, but over the course of, I suppose, just finding snippets of time, particularly once my son was born. You don't have much time, so it was a longer process, and it was also a longer process because as a first-time author, it's a harder process to often have to negotiate, because the rewards of finding your work published can often take a lot longer than it can a second time round. I also think I needed that 10 years just to understand what this book was about, really. Yes. Whereas with Cloudboy, the process was shorter. My connection to it was much more immediate. I was often living the experience and then finding that writing out the lived experience in a fictional manner, which is obviously part of the terrain of poetry, is that it's fiction, was a much sharper and much more swifter process. And I also found that the ability of the manuscript to kind of connect to audiences here and overseas was much more immediate and often much more emotional. And responses were things which buoyed up the writing of this manuscript. So, for instance, often responses were, this was, it wasn't me who said, this is a very important piece of work that you are writing. It was other people hearing the work being performed or reading the work. Whereas, as I say, Lost Relatives took 10 years, this piece of work took 3 years from go to woe. And I do think that it wasn't just about that this was, a lived experience that I then translated into fiction. I think also I'd learnt from the first manuscript the semantic and the structural issues. I'd worked a lot out in terms of how one tackles structures and all that. And so that was there, that became much easier the second time around.
Yeah.
And that speeds up the process.
And some people talk about, art being a form of catharsis. Did you find that, because sometimes that can be a positive thing, but sometimes it can bring up issues, and, did you find it was quite an emotional, how did you find it?
It was deeply emotional, and it remains a deeply emotional experience. As I said, so this is just an illustration, but I've read recently 2 Thursdays in a row from this manuscript for 15 minutes, and literally at the end of the reading of it, I'm still picking myself up off the floor feeling exhausted. The writing of it was cathartic at one level because I was negotiating all those issues that go into this idea, which is fundamentally a concept about how we as societies treat our youngest and most vulnerable members of society, and how there is a disjoint between our commitment to treat members of our society with equality and the actual practice and reality of that happening on the ground. Just kind of exploring those basic subjective and subject thematic issues was one thing. I could use the writing of the manuscript to work those out. But then there's a whole emotional, psychological, personal and historic connectivity that one has as a writer to this work. And those things are not something that are easily worked out in a kind of cathartic way by the writing or completion of a manuscript, or indeed by the immense privilege of having that manuscript selected. In fact, partly you go on the journey thereafter once you're reading out the poems, once you're having it launched, once you're doing interviews. That is still part of the cathartic process behind it. So, I mean, part of the answer is yes, it is catharsis, but it's not a catharsis that is wholly resolved by the simple completion of a manuscript.
So there are questions that come up as well, aren't there, throughout, and for other people it brings up the issue for them too. You've come through with the idea of the clouded eye, or sort of, and that idea of people's misconceptions, or kind of not really seeing, when it comes to your son. Can you talk to me a bit about that, about some of the kind of, I guess, how people have perceived that, and how that...
I think it's very easy for people not to try to understand others on a deeper level unless you get to a much stronger relationship with them. And I think there are numerous things going on here, but primarily when you start school as a child, and reality is that when your child starts school, the parents start school themselves. So the relationships that you have, you're just kind of thrown together with these people, and your child is thrown together with other children, and you try to negotiate your journey through a school at any one point, both as a child and as a parent, just on the basis of finding yourself in this very it's a surreal situation. You're not here because you want to be here. Your child is often here because you're told that they've got to be here, and so forth. So the reality is that often parents will not have a level of understanding of your child that you may have, and so it's often easy, particularly I think in environments like school, for there to be a very strong conformist environment. And so if your child doesn't conform, and because often parents and children are thrown together along this journey, it's very easy for children who do not necessarily or do not easily conform to be misread, or to be read in a way which is primarily of the surface. So they're often, the thing that was it quickly came about was that there are good children, those that conform, and that there are naughty children, those that don't conform.
So that dichotomy of...
Yeah, and that exists. I quickly understood that actually exists not just on a parental level, but it also existed on a teacherly level. And this is not to have any criticism against the teaching environment. I think there are teachers who will be able to understand this issue because they may have met it in other children before your child is someone that they are teaching. But I do think there is an ability for teachers to misread children like this, and I know there is from my own experience, and I know there is from the experience of having people who have heard me read this work and given me feedback, that often teachers, and it's particularly in New Zealand, I'm not sure how it is in Australia, but I was told when I was out in Australia it's a similar situation. These are not children who you would be introduced to if you were taking a degree or study at university for your teacher's college. So the clouded eye, it exists on both a parental, a teacherly level, and can often exist, then manifest itself within the children that this child is journeying through their school with.
So it's sort of a systemic thing as well, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. The difficulties that you've had, did it sort of start early on? Did you recognise some of the differences? How did it come to the diagnosis point? What was the bit of the journey?
Well, the journey was actually quite long, but actually the journey is quite typical of the journey. And I know children who are at school who are still going on the journey. So my son's journey for diagnosis would have been around 6 or 7, but I know children who are 10 and they're still waiting diagnosis or just about to get diagnosis.
Really?
I mean, primarily, as a mother, you know that there is something unusual, different about your child. You get that sense. And so really, I suppose it's easy for me to look back now and say at 2, when we went to the New Zealand institution, the play group, my son was very different. He was not socialising with other children. He was very much of a loner, where other children would kind of want to do, sit down on a mat and have story time. My son wanted to kind of stand at a workbench and bang nails in repeatedly. Those are small things. I can look back and say that, but I suppose the first time that it really sunk in that there was something very pervasively different about him was when, after 2 weeks of starting kindy, so at 3.5, I was asked to go and see the kindy teacher and was told that there was something wrong with my child.
Oh gosh, that's hard.
I was shown in a kind of demonstration, which as an outsider that didn't really come home to me what it was, but I was shown that this is how a normal child, these were the words that we use, this is how a normal child plays, and this is not the way your child is playing. We were fortunate enough to be at apart from that instance, to be at a kindy that was more or less got used to Cameron and is different, and did lots that tried to either just tolerate it or overlook it or just pass it by as being just Cameron. And so those would be things like, at 4, I was again asked to go back and was saying that this was a child who I would drop off at kindy. He would have already started to manifest a set of identities by then. So I would drop him off, and that day he would have decided to be a cat. That day he would have decided to be a tiger. That day he would have decided to be a tortoise. And so that was fine. I mean, I'm as an artistic, liberal parent, that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. But what I didn't realise it was doing was it was manifesting itself then through kindergarten. So, for instance, when I dropped him off and he was his turtle persona, which was called as turtle as can be, he would not communicate with anybody, including his teachers, and he wouldn't. So he was silent because turtles don't speak.
So he kept up that persona throughout the day.
Yeah, and that would mean that he would basically do this across the floor throughout the whole day. So that was when I was told, I kind of understood there was a difference. In reality, I knew that difference was also very disjointed because the difference was lack of social interaction, but with a very intelligent mind. Again, quite early on, I knew very early on that he was very intelligent and could have told you probably at about by a year old that he was surprisingly intelligent to a point at which, you know, he spoke exceedingly early. He walked exceedingly early,
Okay.
like 6 months.
Wow.
He was already talking.
Wow.
And what really made me think that actually this kind of social difference and his high level of intelligence, we needed to do something about it, was before the diagnosis was I took him to see somebody at the New Zealand Gifted Association who specialises in just teaching to children from before primary school, and she said he was, and that he needed to come and join her group, and he did. That was parental supervised, so you had to be there throughout the day that he went. He was thoroughly enjoyed it and was just so sustained by that. But I also took him to the museum one day for a wonderful exhibition on Darwin and his the manifestation of his theories in terms of the orchid. And I didn't know this. I prepped him that we were going to go there, and all of a sudden when we got there, he pulled out this book, which was a drawing book, and he started to draw all of them in minute detail and make notes. He was
Really?
3.5 going on 4.
Wow. Yeah.
And so that's when I knew there was something that I needed to do about it to reach this. And so that's when he had his first diagnosis. And it was indeed confirmed, not to my shock, more to Steve's shock. He was a bit kind of still not sure. I knew it was confirmed. I remember reading the diagnosis and crying, not because it was news to me, but because I suddenly realised that we had something that it would be necessary for me for the next 14 years of this child's life I understood instinctively when I got the diagnosis that I would have to advocate for, would be something that he was potentially be isolated for, and that I would have to work tremendously hard to keep sustaining this immense need within him. Otherwise it would go unsustained, and then that could create real issues in terms of how his psychology would kind of potentially be negatively impacted on. So that was at 4.5, 5. We got that first diagnosis.
So you've had a range of diagnoses, is that right? So what are they? So
well, you see, the range of diagnoses at 4, you see, and this is the kind of why children are still being diagnosed, his friends are still being diagnosed at 10, is that in reality, at 4, you can't give much in the range of a full diagnosis because, and this goes back to the idea of the clouded eye, you know, we're often told, give me the child at 7 and I will give you the man, and I just think that is a complete myth, because actually children are developmental, psychological, emotional, and academic. And so at 4, what they can tell you is a very limited array.
Yes.
So at 4, we were told he was gifted, and the psychologist indicated that she felt there was a diagnosis possibly, but she couldn't give it because he was too young, around ADHD and some Asperger's.
Right.
So in terms of school, you hit school at 5, and all we know for certain is that he's gifted. That's all we know.
It's such a blanket term, isn't it?
Yeah. And what happens is that actually the diagnosis grows into the child, and the child grows into the diagnosis. Because then, you know, his primary school had nothing to go on, but this child was very different. We had to then go back and have another diagnosis at 6, which confirmed that he was gifted. Sorry, no, we had another diagnosis at 6, yes, because he was different. The school was saying, no, he's not gifted, and the diagnosis is wrong. And this diagnosis is not enough for this child anyway, because he started to fail everything. So we had another diagnosis at 6, which confirmed, because the child was a bit older, it confirmed that he was gifted. He had elements of Asperger's, and it confirmed that he had elements of what's called twice exceptional. But it still didn't confirm one very important part of the diagnosis, because these diagnoses are then only educational diagnoses. Yes. You have to go with this child and get another diagnosis, which is pediatrician diagnosis, which will give you other elements of it. Okay. So it's like piecing together a jigsaw, and it wasn't until then he was seven that we got the pediatrician diagnosis, which basically said he also had ADHD going on, and he had oppositional disorder going on, which is a sense in which you oppose instantly any form of constraint that's being put upon you, whether it's just a simple request to do something or, you know, a timeout. You know, and so that's the journey took actually over 3 to 4 to 5 years. But even so, that diagnosis is probably still not 100%, and both the pediatrician and the educational psychologist both said the diagnosis is not complete because the child isn't complete. So, you know, there are things on there which could only be hinted at dyspraxia, which he might only have a mild element of. And so, you know, there are lots of things going on here, but actually today they put kids, they don't kind of diagnose them as one thing. They diagnose them as one thing, which is Asperger, which is on the autism
And the
spectrum
spectrum,
disorder.
yes.
And then they have elements which are strong and weak, which will cover 4, 5 or 6 elements of that disorder.
Right, so it's quite a complex issue, isn't it? How does Cameron understand all of this? You know, when you're talking to him about it, what's his understanding of it?
He understands that he's gifted, and he knew very early on that he was highly intelligent, because he found that when he spoke to his peers, he wanted to talk about things and wanted to focus on things, and there was very little in the way of comeback from there. So he would say, you know, let's have a play, and the child that he's wanting to play with might say, okay, well, let's go and play blocks, and he's going, no, I want to read this, and then I want to kind of find out about that, and then part of the play would be to kind of then role play this, and then we'll kind of also go and do some study of it, and and at 3, what child wants to do that for Cameron? So he understands that he was different, and he also now understands that he has ADHD, and he understands that he's oppositional, and he understands that he has Asperger's. But actually the practicality is that he's not and this goes back to this kind of ongoing diagnosis, he's not at a level at which his rudimentary understanding of those 3 primary things about him can manifest itself into a way in which he can start to self-censor or self-understand, put into practice though, so kind of do things that will stop him from, or will mitigate those things.
Yes, yeah, okay.
And that's not likely to come till he's 12 or 13.
Right.
The ability to suddenly go, okay, I'm doing this, and I need to self-modify myself to restrict my sudden, you know, lots and lots of energy that I've got, which is manifesting itself as ADHD. So, you know, he hasn't got that. What he does have is that by fortune, by kind of leaving his primary school, where we put into real difficulties, and going to another school, he suddenly finds himself in a class of at least 3 other boys who are on the autism spectrum disorder, and have lots of similarities to him, one of which is exceedingly similar, who is yet to just receive the diagnosis, another who is like 3/4 similar, one who's half similar to him. Around labels, you know, there were I don't think there were labels for this. And certainly, you know, growing up in the middle of a housing estate to extremely impoverished parents, whose probably primary responsibility was indeed to give us, you know, I remember times in which my father went to work with shoes that were lined with cardboard. We had no money. And so the actual, you know, their primary function, as they saw it, was simply to put food on a table. The whole issue of kind of dealing with this child who might have this would just be completely not part of their terrain. And so back then, it just wasn't even on the radar. So, you know, and I couldn't have articulated it.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have understood it. And so, you know, it wasn't until you become a parent yourself and you suddenly see it manifesting itself again at a time in which you do have a label for good or ill. Those labels are befriending this child for good or ill, and you have a duty as a parent these days, which you probably didn't have 20 or 30 years ago, a very obvious duty to have to reach that child at some level and try and advocate for them.
Exactly. And just to go back to the clouds, the metaphors there. How did that kind of? So you tell a story about how you were cloud watching with your son in the jungle gym, and so tell me a bit more about that.
So that simply came out of, again, the fact that he had no friends. So He would not have any friends at school, and then I would pick him up at 3 o'clock, and he would be thirsting for social interaction, which he could only get from adults because he couldn't get it from his peers. And all the adults in the school environment weren't going to give it to him because he was a child. So he suddenly wanted to play because he hadn't had that outlet before. And so we had an amazing park very close by to us, and he would simply say, let's go down to the park. We go down to the park, and I would think, okay, to begin with, I think, okay, well, we're just going to do the swings, and we're going to do the roundabouts, and we're going to do the things that the other children are doing, and all the other children down there, and I can kind of help to negotiate relationships with this child whilst he's playing with them. But no, he just kind of walked into the playground, ignored all the other children, climbed to the top of a play park, and lay down and wanted me to do the same. And that's when he just would look up at the sky and start to read the messages and ciphers and pictures that were in the skies above.
Yeah.
And that was his level of finding a friendship with somebody, which was his own mother, the only one that he could get because he couldn't get it from other children. And that suddenly became it was when I was lying up there, playing this game with him repeatedly day after day, and realising that here I was lying on top of the play park with him, side by side, and beneath us were all his school friends running around playing tag, and I suddenly realised that this was a symbol of actually the wider issues going on here, that the desire to read the ciphers in the clouds was symptomatic of his divorcement from social conformity, while simultaneously having this immense imagination,
Yes.
which wasn't being validated or provided for at school. And indeed, there were other times when I was being called at home and going, he doesn't want to do any work, he's not doing any work, he's not gifted, he's not intelligent, all he's doing is constantly distracting himself by staring out of the window watching clouds. And the amount of the teacher repeatedly told me this was a problem because it was stopping him from working. And so I suddenly also realized that it wasn't being validated. It was a natural outlet for him to want to do, but it wasn't being validated by his school. Indeed, he was being punished for this action in the school environment, which was supposed to be reaching his academic intellect.
Yes.
And wasn't.
I mean, my favorite poem is Outer Cumulus. I love that poem, and I like how it's like look into the sky, into the child's mind, and yeah, and also there's that idea as well that all is journey, all is metamorphosis. So tell me a bit more about what how that deeper metaphor that you've come to know through this,
How that manifested
Yeah.
itself. The deeper metaphor for...
Sorry, yeah, just when you're saying, all is journey, all is metamorphosis, and that idea of kind of the temporal nature of things and that journeying.
Yes, okay. How that came about was obviously because, often with these children, there is not just one singular thing. So often you'll find, and certainly parents kept coming up to me when I started to read this, going, well, he was interested in that, and she was interested in this, and she was interested in the other thing, and she was interested in the other. They were, unlike my son, they were, and it still remain, very intense obsessions on subjects. So his was clowns, but he also simultaneously had very intense obsessions on about 5 other things simultaneously.
Right.
And what I suddenly realised was that the deeper thing that was going on here was that whereas often parents were feeding back to me that these things seemed to have no connection at all, I suddenly realised that they were all connected. That these children, my child, was not simply going and kind of having this amazing daily obsession which would manifest itself in speaking about the subject constantly, in wanting to go on the computer and play games connected to it, in only wanting to play child games with this subject, in writing about this subject. It wasn't just that they were doing that on one subject, they were doing it on 5 or 6, all at the same time, carrying all these, but that actually there was a deeper connection to these subjects. These subjects were actually were connected. They weren't isolated, and that actually what they were about was a journey into the subject, a constant journey, but that itself was a journey, a singular journey, carrying all these things that was, I liken it to the fact that it was like Doctor Who, because this was one of his obsessions, and this was the one that really made the connection, was that he was looking at clouds, and he was, he was so immersed in Doctor Who that he knew all of the 12 doctors. He could tell you about which doctor was the most interesting for him, which doctor, in his opinion, was the best. He could cite all the episodes.
Yeah.
Had watched all the episodes. There was a connection between those two things at a deeper level, which was about wormholes. That actually, each of these subjects allowed them to journey into their mind, and to have their mind journeyed into another world, other dimensions,
Wow.
which was giving them a validation that their mind that was journeying was was positive.
Wow.
And so I remember realizing that it's it's like what's the word? And I use it in my essay, not wormholes, but I forget what the word is, but it's like giving you suddenly a window into another world, an alien world, an ability to kind of open up this other surreal, non-Earth-like world